The Collings I-35 LC Vintage is among the best boutique takes on a vintage semi-hollow body guitar. But how does it compare versus the real deal? A 1961 Gibson ES-335. I'm Jonathan, welcome. Today we're going to get into some semi-hollow body guitar territory, specifically covering the iconic ES-335. These guitars are renowned for their versatility, both live and in the studio, and even unplugged at home on the couch. And I consider myself lucky to own two dream examples, my vintage Gibson and this modern offering from Collings. Since doing deep dives on each of these guitars here on the channel, many of you asked for a direct comparison. And that makes a ton of sense given how Collings has gone all in on chasing that vintage semi-hollow voice. And to illustrate the point directly from Collings' website, the I-35 LC Vintage model is specifically stated as for players seeking a highly expressive and dynamic instrument evocative of a great 60s semi-hollow. So in today's video, we're going to see how the Collings I-35 Vintage stacks up to the vintage 1961 Gibson ES-335. And so what I'll cover is a quick backstory of each of the guitars. For more in-depth reviews, see the links down below. I'll also do several tone comparisons across several styles, both isolated and in the context of a mix. I'll cover all the key specs, both the similarities and differences, and how that relates to the playing experience overall. And then I'll wrap up with my thoughts as to how I think the Collings stacks up to the vintage benchmark and whether or not I plan to keep both in the collection. Thank you to my Patreons. For anyone that would like to support the channel further, you can access backing tracks, lessons, tabs, and tone breakdowns for all my original music that I feature here on the channel by clicking on the Patreon link in the description below. So my vintage 61 335 came out of Neil Sean's collection from Journey. I acquired it from Brian's Guitars, and it's all original. It has genuine PAFs. I did have it refretted, and I replaced the ABR1 with a replica from Four Uncles Restoration in order to get this guitar playing optimally. And the Collings I-35 LC Vintage I acquired during a visit to Nashville from Carter Vintage when I was on the hunt for a Les Paul. I immediately connected with this guitar and bought it, despite having recently acquired the vintage 335. Again, deep dive review is linked below. So let's start out with some clean tones. I'll be plugging straight into my 2-Rock Bloomfield drive with a touch of reverb from the amp. And let's start with the neck position. I'll do some basic strumming before switching over to the middle position where I'll play the arpeggiated rhythm from the intro music. So let's check it out. So I thought both guitars had plenty of sustain and had that nice natural airiness that semi-hollow body guitars are known for. I thought the Collings intonation was excellent up high, and I thought the vintage 335 intonation actually held its ground as well, and I owe that to the extensive restoration work that I had done to it. Now, while PAF tones are all over the map, they do have a common baseline of clarity and chime, and I was hearing plenty of that from both guitars as well. Where I started hearing some subtle differences was more in the frequency response and the output. I thought the Collings had a more extended high-end and low-end range, and maybe a little hotter output than the vintage 335. But have an ear out for those qualities as I continue to put these guitars through the paces, and let me know what you're picking up on. So as for construction, both these guitars are made out of maple laminate with solid center blocks. However, the 335 is an all maple center block, whereas the Collings is a maple spruce combination. The Collings is also a slightly smaller body. It's about 1 inch narrower at 15 inches versus around 16 on the 335. Now, weights, of course, vary by guitar, but I do think it's safe to say with the center block choice and smaller body of the Collings, they do come in lighter on average compared to the Gibson without sacrificing acoustic resonance. This specific Gibson's weighing in at 7 pounds, 12.1 ounces, while this specific Collings is weighing in at 6 pounds, 12.9 ounces. So up next, let's kick on some light overdrive. For this, I'll be using a Vemoram Janray, which does a nice job of approximating a deluxe reverb, slightly breaking up. And I'll stay in the middle position, both pickups engaged, and let's see how the guitars respond to some delicate finger picking. So I thought the character was quite similar between both guitars with great clarity and responsiveness. I did think that the light overdrive pronounced some of the differences we heard in the clean sample, where I was hearing the Collings with an extended high-end and low-end frequency response and a little bit of a mellower mid-focused output from the 335. So let's move on to the necks and playability. So what these necks have in common is that they're both made out of Honduran mahogany, both have 12-inch fingerboard radiuses, and both of them have 1 11/16 inch nut widths. Where they start to differ in spec is that the Collings has a slightly longer scale length. It's coming in at 24 7/8 inches, whereas the Gibson is coming in at 24 3/4 inches. That's a subtle but noticeable difference that does require some subtle adjustments to your playing to keep your bends in tune when you're switching between the two different scale lengths, but the adjustments aren't as extreme when switching to like a 25-inch or higher scale length. The vintage Gibson has a Brazilian rosewood fingerboard, whereas the Collings is using East Indian rosewood. And while the Collings was indeed aiming for a 1960s style semi-hollow body guitar, the neck profile is quite a bit different than this 61 example. The 61 is featuring Gibson's slim taper profile. When Neil Sean was demoing this in the Heritage Auctions video, he did mention it as having a tiny but very comfortable neck. So let's take some measurements to showcase those differences. So the Collings is coming in at 0.86 inches at the first fret, and I'm coming in at 0.81 inches on the vintage Gibson. This one actually reminds me a lot of the genuine 1960 burst that I had played for Brian's guitars. Very similar profile, somewhere between the slim taper and a classic 59 carve. So to showcase the playability, I'll play some lead lines up and down the neck over a 1-6-4-5 loop so we can hear how the guitars each speak in all of the different registers. And I'll kick on a tube screamer and play some soulful licks, and I'll toggle through the neck, middle, and bridge positions to hear the full range of tones. Yet again, I thought both guitars sounded great in this scenario. I heard the Collings is a little more exciting and the 335 is a little sweeter and maybe a touch more sustain out of the Collings, whereas the 335 sounded very much like an old record, which makes a ton of sense given these golden age Gibsons are all over so many classic records. But if we were to jump in a time machine and sub out the 335s of the day with the Collings, I don't think any of the classic players would have batted an eyelash. So Collings is known for their insane build quality, and I think that's evidenced by the setup I was able to perform on this guitar. I like my neck straight with no relief with as low action as possible without buzzing through the amp. And on this Collings, I was able to get the action down to 0.75 millimeters on the low bass side at the 12th fret, and nearly down to 0.5 millimeters on the high E string. The vintage Gibson is at 1 millimeter on the low bass on the 12th fret and around 0.75 millimeters on the high E. So an absolutely incredible setup on the vintage guitar. And I owe that to the restoration work done by Healy's Guitars. They planed the fingerboard, did a brand new refret. I ended up replacing the vintage ABR bridge with a replica, and I really got this guitar playing optimally. So the bottom line is that the playability is great on both of these guitars, and it doesn't get much better than the Collings straight out of the box. And if you're going down the Gibson route, I can say that the modern Gibsons, especially the ones I've acquired over the last few years, I've been able to do really good setups on those as well with low action. So up next, I'm going to focus on the bridge position and kick up the gain a notch using a Vemoram Shanks ODS1, which is inspired by the classic Nobles ODR1. And I'll do some swankier blues rock riffage and licks. So I thought both guitars sounded thick yet clear and had that classic PAF cluck and chirp. And again, I was hearing a little more output and sustain from the Collings and a little more mid-focus from the 335. So let's talk electronics and hardware. So what these guitars have in common is they both have two PAF style pickups. They both have the same control layouts, 2 volumes, 2 tones, and a 3-way switch. They both have the same specs for pots and caps, and they both come with a non-wired ABR1 and stop tailpiece. Now, of course, a lot of the parts, suppliers, and materials from 60 years ago don't exist today, so Collings has done their best to source vintage sounding components. When it comes to the pickups, we've got genuine PAFs. These are short magnet A5s. On the Collings, you have throwback pickups, and they're the throwback pickups that were designed specifically for this model. Now, there's no one standard PAF sound, but they do share a common characteristic of clarity, chime, and no hum, which both these guitars exhibit. I do hear the vintage PAFs as having slightly less output and a mellower attack compared to the Collings, which is a little hotter and a little brighter attack. That could just be due to the magnets aging or just how these PAFs happen to be wound that day. Now, I could have experimented with raising the pickup height a little on the 335 to better match the output, but my philosophy is to set the pickup height where I think it sounds best with each individual guitar. And the pots and caps are both spec'd at 500K, 0.22 caps. The 335 has Central Lab pots with sprayed caps. The Collings has DiMarzio pots with Jupiter caps. Both guitars are very responsive. There could be some drift intolerance over the decades with the 335, and I know Collings really went out of their way to design a harness specifically for this model that would recreate some of the vintage taper and responsiveness. So let's see how these guitars can handle some high gain. I'm going to stay in the bridge position and rock out with my Vemoram Jan Ray boosted by my BK Butler tube driver. subtle but distinct differences here. Now, while high gain can tend to mask the true voice of a guitar, there were some perceptible differences that I think are worth noting. In particular, the extended high frequencies of the Collings, while it didn't sound bad, I did start to hear a little more fizziness and hash in the high frequencies with all that distortion. On the other hand, the more mellow and mid-focused voice of the Vintage 335 tended to act as a natural roll-off there and minimize some of that hashy fizz in the upper frequencies. And I heard a little bit more of the note fundamentals shining through. But pretty subtle stuff overall, and I thought both guitars have held up really well throughout the various gain stages we've done so far. So both guitars are finished in nitro, but of course, being a vintage example, there's a lot of natural wear and tear and aging on the 61 335. You can see a lot of beautiful natural checking, and the natural checking runs vertically along the body instead of horizontally. For whatever reason, that's how the old semi-hollows tended to check. The Murphy Lab stuff comes really close to approximating the look and feel, but there's still something about the real deal that is quite unique. Feels very thin, very hard. And I know nitro continues to off-gas as it ages, and of course it's highly interactive with the environment. So there's just something about the old nitro finishes that's still quite charming and hard to replicate. That being said, Collings has done an excellent job with their nitro finish. It's very thin, hard, non-sticky, and they've replicated the checking pretty flawlessly. You can see vertical checking both on the front and back of the guitar. They've also knocked back some of the shine off of the hardware, but that's where they stop with the aging. The rest of the guitar is in mint condition, so no artificial relic. The back of the neck does not have any lacquer checking whatsoever. And I really think they're onto something here with giving the classic aesthetic of a very lightly aged guitar, but leaving room for the player to wear it in themselves. So now let's compare both guitars in the context of the mix. I'll replay the intro solo and A-B between both guitars to see what differences we can hear in that context. And let me know which one you preferred. So I have 5 takeaways after comparing each of these guitars, and I'll sum those up before sharing my perspective on how close I think the Collings comes at recreating the magic of a 60s semi-hollow. And if I can only keep one, which one would it be? I think Collings succeeded in delivering a vintage voiced semi-hollow, albeit with a slightly extended frequency range. And I found that the Gibson has that focused mid-range punch that you would find on classic rock records. So both fantastic voices, slightly different, and it's really a draw for me as to which one sounds better. As for the feel and aesthetic, the Collings does feel newer, but in a good way. It's aged just enough to give it a vintage vibe with the checked lacquer and the aged hardware, but without the downsides of relicking. Closest offer from Gibson today would be the Murphy Lab Ultralight age, but even those do have some light relicking. But I personally prefer the approach Collings has taken with the light aging, no relicking. As for fit and finish, Collings are truly flawless and top tier. Now, if you go Gibson, the vintage stuff is likely gonna need some restoration work like mine did, but if you go through that, you can really get great results. And the modern day Gibson custom shop stuff has really improved, and you can also get some excellent quality coming out of there as well. But overall, I'd give the nod to Collings, as their track record with quality control has been stellar. As for ergonomics, I do slightly prefer the Collings. Its smaller body does make it lighter weight and a little easier to handle without sacrificing acoustic resonance. That being said, the Gibson 335 is still a very light guitar and has wonderful ergonomics. And then lastly, the scale length difference is small but noticeable. So if you're switching between different scale lengths often, it could trip you up. It's only a minor adjustment, but it's something to be aware of. Ideally, I would prefer the 24 3/4 inch scale length, just so there's less adjustments between my other guitars that mostly have this scale length. However, I would hesitate to change anything about the Collings. I assume they chose the 24 7/8 inch scale length for a reason, and the guitar sounds fantastic. It's so responsive, and it is really easy to play. So overall, I do believe Collings succeeded in their mission to create a guitar that was evocative of a great 60s semi-hollow. I found that they really struck the perfect balance of vintage vibe, aesthetic, feel, and tone, with some slight refinements that give the Collings just enough of its own voice to justify having one of each. But if I was forced to only keep one, it would probably be the Collings, both for practical reasons. It's not a cheap guitar by any stretch, but it's much more affordable than a golden age Gibson. And while you can't 100% recreate the vintage vibe and tone of a golden era Gibson, the Collings gets very close and has some of its own refinements, in addition to having flawless fit, finish, and playability right out of the box. So let me know which one you would pick, and if you've played a Collings and or any other 335 style guitars, I would love to know your thoughts. And if you want to go down the 335 rabbit hole some more, let me know if you'd be interested in comparing the Collings or vintage Gibson to some of my other instruments. I have a Thorn Grand Tora, which is his take on a vintage 335, and I've got my most recently acquired Les Paul. They say 335s are burst killers, so that might make for a fun comparison as well. But let me know what you'd be interested in seeing next. And if you enjoyed the video and you want to support the channel further, check out the links below. I have a link to my Patreon, which includes backing tracks, tabs, lessons, tone breakdowns from the music in all my videos, along with a link to my original music at Bandcamp. Appreciate the support. See you in the next video.